Hello and welcome to the Max MPS Radio. My name is Jan Frisse, and today I'm honored to have Danny Lennon from CICO Nutrition on here. We're kind of, I think, planning this episode for a while now, so I'm glad today we got it framed out and are doing it. We will talk about all things to understand energy balance. And yeah, man, I'm happy to do this, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you for asking me on. Hopefully I can say something useful here.
I'm sure you can. So can you just quickly introduce yourself and maybe tell the audience a little bit about CICO Nutrition?
Sure. So I run a company called CICO Nutrition with the goal of putting out evidence-based content on nutritional science primarily, but we also talk about related things like sleep, health science, performance, and so on, but the main theme being nutrition. I've been doing that for the past 7+ years. The main form of content I guess people know us for is the podcast CICO Nutrition Radio, which similarly has been running for over 7 years now. And in addition to the podcast, I've been lucky enough to do quite a lot of seminars, conferences, things like that. And we also have an online coaching service where 4 of our coaching staff work with people one-on-one. Before, my role was mainly just doing content. I used to work as a nutrition practitioner as well with all sorts of people, but for a while specifically looking at weight class based sports. So worked with a lot of MMA athletes, boxers, I've worked with some powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, so different athletes making weight for competition. And so that was for a number of years, and I've ended up talking about that type of stuff. And previous to starting CICO Nutrition, my academic background is a master's degree in nutritional sciences, and my undergrad degree is in biology and physics. And yeah, that's, I suppose, a quick overview, but I'm happy to get into any specifics that we may want to.
I mean, it's just insane. I mean, we were talking before how you're just podcasting for 7 years at this point. So I remember I was to a seminar of yours was that in 2018? Could that be? And was it in London?
I think that was 2017.
End of 2017? Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, the London one was 2017, maybe the end of that year, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I can just say all the best things about your content and your work. I mean, I'm consuming it for 2000. I started consuming it in 2016, I think. And I mean, in this realm, in this bubble, it's probably one of the biggest and most qualitative podcasts that has been on here.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you very much.
So how are things over there in Ireland?
So right now we're in the midst of a full lockdown, I think similar to you guys, and a lot of the EU at least. We have been in our highest level of lockdown, a level 5 lockdown, since the 30th of December. It is now late April, so we expect some more easing in early May, but what that will be, we're not too sure yet. But as of right now, we're still in a case where most retail shops are closed, gyms are closed. There's restrictions on how far you can travel. You can only meet up with one other household, and that has to be in an outdoor setting, things like that. So pretty restrictive for a number of months now.
Absolutely.
But yeah, kind of just hoping at this point that the vaccine rollout kind of picks up some speed, and maybe in a couple of months from now, things look a lot different and some way normal again.
I'm crossing my fingers for you guys. So today we are actually going to talk about energy balance, which I think a lot of people are aware of, at least the broad understanding of it. So you have written an article about that, an extensive article, which is at least two part, the kind of like the blueprint of the structure I have laid out for today. When did you actually wrote that piece of content?
It was within the last few months, I think, for that most recent one. I can't remember what day it was. I mean, I can check now, but it's within the last few months, I think.
I will make sure to link that in the description, and for people that are interested in it, they can read it by themselves. So maybe we just start with the with today's initial question, which is kind of like a little bit more broad. So could you explain the concept of calories in, calories out, or in short CICO, and give us a broad overall introduction to the concept as a whole, and what limitation it has for implication on body comp goals or body comp changes?
Cool. So I'll give maybe some of the basics that I'm sure much of your audience will already be aware of, and then as we go on, we can build up in levels of complexity, because there are some interesting nuances related to energy balance that are not so obvious at the outset. But to start with the most basic understanding, the energy balance equation, or calories in, calories out, simply refers to how much energy is coming into the system, and the system in this case being the body, and leaving it. And the net difference between those two will tell us how much energy is either lost from the body or stored within the body. So the energy in, or the calories in, is relatively simple. That is the calorie content of the foods we are consuming. The energy out, or our energy expenditure, that calories outside, is a bit more complex, and it has a couple of different components to it. It includes our resting metabolic rate, so the calories we expend just to function and exist, essentially. So even when we're unconscious, we are still using energy for our organs to function, for example. We have a physical activity component that we could break down into actual physical activity, so when we're doing exercise. But then there's also another component that relates to activity called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, and I'm sure you've probably discussed this at length in the podcast before. So that would be more subconscious movements that aren't actual planned exercise, but still use up some degree of energy. So for example, if I'm standing around here and I'm moving a bit about the room, or as I'm cooking, I'm moving about the kitchen somewhere, or someone that is fidgeting a bit more, those things are very small, but they're still using up some energy, but we wouldn't class them as actual exercise. And then we have the thermic effect of feeding, or also called diet-induced thermogenesis. And this is energy that is expended, or calories that are burned to digest food. And depending on what types of foods we're talking about, they may have slightly different values, but essentially to digest food is going to use up some energy. So when we add up that thermic effect of feeding, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, physical activity, and a resting metabolic rate, that would be our total energy expenditure, or our calories out. So the energy balance equation is just what is the difference between calories in and calories out. If they are equal, we are at energy balance. If there's more calories coming into the body than is being expended, that would be a calorie surplus, or a net positive calorie balance. And if there's more calories being expended than is coming in, then we would have a calorie deficit, or net negative energy balance. And so how this relates to body composition is it's a pretty good proxy to tell us what's likely going to happen. Now, as we'll probably explore, within body composition, we're looking at either losing fat mass or gaining muscle mass most typically. And energy balance, so whether we have a calorie deficit or a calorie surplus, doesn't exactly tell us how many grams of muscle tissue are going to be gained, or how many grams of fat are going to be lost per se, at least in a direct calculation. What we're talking about here is the energy going in and out of the system. And we know to lose fat mass, we need to create a calorie deficit. And that is the more simple side. We'll probably come to gaining muscle later, because that's slightly different. But for, let's say, to lose body fat mass, the energy balance equation, so calories in, calories out, doesn't exactly tell us how much fat someone is going to lose if we just know those two things. And everyone listening probably knows this, right? That if you eat a certain number of calories, how much fat mass you actually lose over the next number of weeks is also going to relate to, well, what type of training are we doing? How much protein are we consuming, etc. Those things all factor in to dictate how much of the fat mass is going to be lost, how much lean mass is going to be lost, etc., etc. So all the energy balance equation is doing is explaining how much energy is going in and out of the body. Why it's important for body composition is to lose body fat mass, there needs to be a calorie deficit present, which I'm sure, hopefully everyone listening has probably heard a number of times in this episode.
They will.
And then when it comes to gaining muscle mass, this is where there's a kind of slight bit of difference in that you can gain muscle mass without being in a calorie surplus per se, but as a general rule, the best environment to build muscle mass is going to be in a calorie surplus, positive energy balance. And so that's why we tend to talk about energy balance equation in relation to changing body composition. So that's a kind of overview, but we can get into any specifics you might want to discuss.
That was a great summary, and I think we will touch on different variables and how they're influencing, for example, body weight changes. So could you just expand a little bit on what factors are actually, other than energy balance, are actually influencing weight changes?
Sure. So when it comes to a change in our weight, so in other words, our total body mass, first we can break that down into two separate components. One is actual changes in tissue, which is what we care about when changing body composition. And really, bodybuilding generally is concerned with the changing of two types of tissue. One is fat tissue and one is muscle tissue. So changing the amount of fat tissue we have or the amount of muscle tissue we have will obviously have some impact on our total body mass. But there are other components that don't relate to changes in tissue that can change your scale weight. And again, people are probably familiar with this, particularly if they weigh themselves regularly. Probably the three main ones to discuss would be, number one, your hydration status. So for example, if you dehydrate yourself, you will weigh less on a scale, so your body mass decreases, but you haven't changed the amount of mass of tissue you have. So your body fat hasn't changed and your muscle mass hasn't changed, but your scale weight has changed. So total body water will dictate a change in mass. Second will be glycogen stores, so carbohydrates stored in your muscle or your liver. If you change that up or down, again, your scale weight will change, but your fat mass hasn't changed and your muscle mass hasn't changed. And then third, we could talk about gut residue. So this is the amount of undigested material that is still within your intestine or within your gut. So the amount of this that's in there, obviously, if there's undigested food in your gastrointestinal tract, that has some weight to it. So if you change the amount of that residue that's still in your gut, there will be a change in scale weight, but you're not changing, again, your muscle mass or your fat mass. So those are all components that can change your scale weight. And of course, what we want to really care about is what are the changes in tissue, fat tissue and muscle tissue. And that's why we have to be aware of these other things that can influence scale weight if we're trying to use body weight as a proxy of whether we're making progress or not.
I think that's probably one of the most important things to know if you're actually trying to interpret body weight changes and how those are going to affect your body comp, and in both directions, like cutting and bulking. Could you touch a little bit more on like the side of like external stressors influencing the body and how that leads to body weight changes, like stress through just general life and or stress through training?
Yeah, so this is an area where we could definitely look at mechanistically reasons why this could influence body weight. It's a bit hard to make broad suggestions because, again, some of this needs to be teased out a bit better, I think. But in general, at least anecdotally, people will note that, let's say, in times of stress, they might see a change in their body weight. And that's usually put down to an increase in body water. So some water retention is most commonly named as the culprit when people are stressed. Some people have suggested different mechanisms for that. One would be that in times of high stress, there may be an increase in cortisol levels. And cortisol levels can react with the receptors for aldosterone, which is related to water retention. So that's one kind of hypothesis that's being put out there, that in times of heightened stress, you can see, let's see, more water being held onto. And then in times when people relax or are less stressed, you may lose some of that water. So that you see the fluctuations in body water status. So that can be one. Other things that can be a bit strange that, again, people may notice anecdotally that again tend to vary quite a bit, so I'm not sure if we have a real clear answer to it, but most often you might see with people, let's say, competing in powerlifting or other weight class based sports, that when they go into a taper before competition, you sometimes see a change in scale weight that you kind of wouldn't have predicted. And just because the fact that they've massively changed their workload and the work stress related to their training program, that they tend to see a change in weight pretty dramatically in that kind of final week. So there are things like that, again, that may relate to stress. And again, there's some hypothesis as to why that might be the case. But yeah, it can be highly variable how people respond to something like that change in stress.
In that peaking week, is that usually a change to an increase, or is that usually more a decrease in like a powerlifting athlete, for example?
Yeah, so that example I was giving was related to a drop in weight. Now, some people might see different, like some people taper and they don't notice any difference. Some people in that final week find it very hard to change weight and really struggle to do a weight cut even. But in certain cases, it's people will report that they massively reduce the amount of training they do within that kind of final week, which would be quite typical, especially if it's quite an aggressive taper, and weight drops quite significantly, despite the fact they're actually doing less movement, and they're even keeping their food intake for relatively similar. So that may be a stress related thing. But like I said, that's not a thing that happens across the board in everyone, but at least anecdotally, I've seen that reported.
Okay, so I think we just come to the conclusion that fluctuations are pretty normal because they're influenced by so many variables. I think just a good coping strategy for that in practice is to just maybe rather than seeing day-to-day changes, rather look at the average from week to week. And if you're not sure, if you have variables that are influencing your body weight that aren't or were unpredictable, that you may just look from, rather than looking from week to week, rather look maybe on a 2-week time frame or even 3 weeks. Is there anything you want to add to that practical side?
So I think this is, again, depending on who we're talking about and what metrics they're tracking and how precise they want or need to be. So if we're talking about someone average in the population, they may weigh themselves, but they might not be tracking their food intake militantly. And in that case, I would say to them, look, don't worry about these fluctuations up and down. We'll do exactly what you said. We'll take averages each week. And if the average is going down gradually over time, and we look over the past month and the average is dropping and trending downwards, then we're happy. We don't need to worry about too much else. It might be slightly different than if we take, let's say, someone that goes into a contest prep, where there's obviously going to be a heightened focus on, am I making enough progress? And those changes can be psychologically quite difficult for a lot of people to deal with. So again, we would say those things of look at the average over the weeks, try and keep the focus on, is it trending downwards? But what you also might probably do in that case, because for someone doing a contest prep, it's highly likely they're going to be tracking their macros and tracking their food intake quite carefully, whereas the person in the average population probably isn't. So what you can do in that case of someone who is tracking their food intake, you can make sure you're looking at, well, what is their carbohydrate intake across these days? And do these fluctuations relate to, hold on, like the last 2 days, I've dramatically changed my usual carbohydrate intake for some reason. Either they do it by accident, or maybe they do a planned refeed or something like that, or they do low carb days, something that would explain the change or the fluctuation in weight. Similar, they might note that, oh, hold on, my fiber intake has dramatically changed over the last day or two for whatever reason. That might explain it. They can also track their fluid intake, and if they realize, oh, actually, I wasn't paying enough attention and my fluid intake wasn't as high as it usually is, and I drank 1.5 liters or 2 liters less than normal, then that explains why maybe I have a bigger drop than I'd planned, etc. So I think you can kind of, in those cases where you're tracking all those metrics, you can keep them more similar. That would cut down on the chance of there being these massive fluctuations. Or if you do see a fluctuation, you'll be able to explain it a bit better. So yeah, depending on if someone is tracking a lot of that stuff or not, it may be easier to not see wild fluctuations.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. I think in like a body composition or in like a bodybuilding setting, in physique sports, you are definitely also mainly looking at body comp changes in pictures as well, especially in like a diet setting where you can see changes from week to week. But I mean, it could be even that like that your look is not good and you didn't lost weight. Or you didn't lose weight, so you're in a situation where your weight, for example, maintained, and you look worse. So what are you doing? You could even cut further. I mean, that's totally depending on your schedule as well, and how much time you have, and how much puffer you eventually planned into there as well. But I think it's just really useful to track at least the basic variables in, for example, a contest prep setting, and then looking at the metrics, like you said, and see if there's maybe a trend that may have influenced your body weight and even like your visual body composition in pictures.
Yeah, and I think that's even more crucial because the problem with investing too much in what your scale weight is going to be, particularly on a specific day, and you're not taking into account like those averages or those trends, or you're not looking at pictures and trying to be a bit more objective. Am I looking better? If you're only concerned about the scale weight, then over time it's super common and it's understandable why it happens, that when people are so worried about that, they'll start doing things to fool themselves into thinking they're making that progress, right? They'll leave their weigh-in in the morning an hour later than normal. So they've gone an hour extra since their last meal, and that might have some sort of influence. Or they'll stop drinking water a bit earlier in the evening because they know that means they'll have a lighter weigh-in tomorrow. And again, these are things that you could say, well, what's the point? We're just fooling ourselves. And we are, but it happens once, especially in that mindset of the only thing that matters is I'm so worried about what my weight tomorrow morning is going to be, instead of thinking about the bigger picture, I guess.
And I mean, that can even have then some psychological influence of you stressing out even more because your body weight is not going down. I think, it's totally individual and context dependent, but there's even, as you said, the flip side, where in a contest prep, if you're on a schedule, if you have a scheduled date, you can't just wait weeks and weeks and weeks without doing any changes if the body weight is not dropping. Because 1 week is fine, 1 week can be totally explainable, maybe 2 weeks, and that at the third week, for example, I would most likely do something about it. It's a slightly different situation for female athlete. And the influence of the menstrual cycle on weekly body weight changes, without now expanding on that. But I want to at least include that note that for female athletes, it could be a better idea to compare monthly averages rather than weekly averages.
Yes, agreed on that point.
So with where we now pretty much touched on body comp, on body weight changes and how those can be influenced. So you kind of touched on it a little bit in the I think it was the first question. So could you explain how you calculate a caloric surplus in relation to the planned rate of gain, and why gaining muscle is more energy demanding than the pure caloric value of protein?
Yeah, so this is a kind of a complex thing in practice to try and work out, well, how many extra calories will equate to a certain amount of muscle gain. Because we can theorize over how much muscle, let's say per month, is it possible for this individual to build, and we can come up with some rough approximations. We can do some calculations to say, okay, this many extra calories per month or per week or per day should be suitable to build that degree of muscle tissue. But what we then need to take into account from a practical perspective is two things. Number one, the gain in weight is going to be more than the actual gain in muscle tissue. And it actually might be a significant amount more, particularly if we're trying to go through a phase where, if we're monitoring, let's say, body weight as one metric from week to week, to be really sure that we're gaining muscle, to detect a change would be very difficult at the actual rates of gain of muscle tissue. So let's take a hypothetical person you're working with, and let's say it's possible for them maybe to gain 0.3 kilos in a month of actual new muscle tissue. To try and track that, if we're trying to calculate the exact calorie surplus that would lead to only that gain in muscle tissue and no extra body fat, for example, would be so difficult to detect week to week, because those slight changes would be more than enough to be explained by just some random fluctuation. So that's why typically people are probably going to go a bit faster than the rate of or the amount of muscle tissue they're looking to build. The second thing that I think is probably even more practically important, as to why some of these calculations might not be or don't play out as you would plan based on paper, is that to have a certain degree of a calorie surplus is not the same thing as how many extra calories above maintenance is this person going to need to eat. So let me explain that a bit. We know that there's metabolic adaptations that occur when we undereat, but also when we overeat. So if you're in a calorie, if you undereat your maintenance intake or you overeat above that, when you change those calories in, you have a change in energy expenditure. So when you decrease your energy intake, then your body adapts and decreases your energy expenditure to some degree. And the biggest change in that is a drop in NEAT levels. Again, this may be something that's been discussed before. You also have the reverse happen when someone goes into an overfeeding state and they increase their food intake. You also get an increase in their energy expenditure. So that means, let's say we had it worked out perfectly based on the energy value of certain amount of tissue that we're going to build and so on. And we worked out that it's 100 calories or 150 calories or whatever of a surplus this individual might need to build that degree of muscle tissue in a month. Then increasing their food intake above maintenance by that amount doesn't mean they are in a 100 calorie surplus now, because there's going to be an increase in energy expenditure, most likely the same way the reverse would happen if we decrease intake. And then we know that metabolic adaptation is highly variable from person to person. So you overfeed one person by 500 calories and they get a large increase in expenditure. You overfeed someone else that has a similar maintenance intake by the same amount of calories and they don't have as strong of a metabolic adaptation. Now you increase both individuals by 500 calories, but their actual surplus is very different. So practically, that's why we wouldn't stick to just working out some sort of calculation based on hypothetically how much energy it takes to create a pound of muscle tissue, for example. But rather we would need to see, okay, when we increase their intake, are they typically gaining at an appropriate amount of weight that we would dictate? And that's one way. Now, of course, I would acknowledge there's some coaches that don't necessarily do that. They would put in an extra amount of food and then would base it on how is the athlete performing, maybe how the athlete is looking, and so on. Particularly for gaining phases over a long period of time, they might not be as worried about seeing a specific rise in weight gain. But I think in a lot of cases, people will tend to use weight gain as an easy marker to be kind of just absolutely sure that that muscle is being built at the most optimal rate. So I don't know if that ramble answers the question or kind of makes any sense, but I think that's the way I tend to think through this question of how much extra calories does someone need to build muscle at their optimal rate. I think it's going to depend on those factors, most notably how they respond to an increase in calories. So hopefully that made sense.
Practically it did, absolutely. So I think there's just merit for a lot of people to not restrict body weight too much. So not, let's say, going under a specific really low rate of gain, because at some point you are only really, like, it could be that you just gained really slightly for 1 or 2 weeks, and then you lose a bit, and then at after 3 weeks you're pretty much at plus minus zero again. So I think there's just like this quote unquote switch that you want to switch from a caloric surplus that is most likely beneficial for anabolic environment or milieu to maximizing muscle mass. I would be interested in why you think that building muscle is an energy demanding process in the first place, but also why it probably needs more than 4,000 calories, which would be roughly the value of a kg of protein, to build 1 kg of muscle.
Yeah. So number one, I'm not convinced we actually have like really clear data on how much of a surplus is required to build the optimum amount of muscle, let's say without a huge gain in body fat. So that kind of, what is essentially that question of people, what they care about is like, what is the amount of calories that will maximize my muscle mass gain whilst minimizing the amount of fat that I gain in that phase? And it's surprising how that hasn't really been directly answered. I know there's actually studies underway. I believe Eric Helms and James Krieger, and I believe Brad Dieter maybe are involved in that study. I don't believe it's being published as of yet. But I know that's kind of underway to see, do we see actual differences when we have a couple of hundred calories of a surplus versus not? So I'm not too sure we actually have a clear as answer as I would maybe like to give. I think in terms of increasing energy expenditure, there's, like I said, when we increase that caloric intake, where those calories go is also another question. And to think all of it would go towards building contractile muscle tissue is probably not accurate. Like we said, there's going to be some of it that's going to be used up. There's some of it that's going to go towards building other things within the body. So not all of that extra calories is going directly to building muscle. And for that reason, that's why you can't force more muscle gain simply by eating a bigger and bigger calorie surplus. There's a kind of ceiling to how much muscle can be built. So I'm not sure I actually have a good answer to that question. There's probably people that have looked at those numbers a bit more specifically and have maybe done some kind of theoretical calculations of what in theory should work out to be that precise number of a surplus that would mean maximal gain with no fat gain. But yeah, I don't think I'm probably the best person to answer on that.
So could you still expand on why building muscle is such an energy demanding process? Maybe even from like a evolutionary perspective?
Well, I guess from my understanding, at least, this isn't something that we're like. It's a process that we're almost have to force an adaptation to, and to build new tissue is probably not going to be prioritized versus other processes within the body. Would be my best guess from an evolutionary perspective. And so it wouldn't make sense that just very easily the body just builds more and more muscle tissue without really no ceiling to it. And yeah, like I don't know if I'm picking up the question correctly, but that would be my best guess from an evolutionary standpoint. But
you did.
Yeah.
So you kind of touched on that a little bit. Could you expand on why the quote-unquote anabolic environment of an increasing caloric surplus is diminishing at a certain point?
Sure. So I think one of the interesting things to note is, and I think I kind of made a point of this in the article, was why we need to view gaining muscle and losing body fat as different in a number of ways, not just that they're opposite, but by that I mean to lose body fat, a calorie surplus is both necessary and sufficient. So by that I mean a calorie surplus is necessary in that if you don't have a calorie deficit, you do not lose body fat. Second, it's also sufficient. If you do have a calorie surplus, then regardless of whether you train or not, whether you eat high protein or not, whether you do anything really, you're going to lose fat mass, right? If you just starve someone and that's a large calorie deficit, that is sufficient to cause a loss of body fat. So it's both necessary and sufficient. Going the opposite way, it doesn't work out for muscle gain. So a calorie surplus is neither necessary nor is it sufficient. So by that I mean, if you just increase someone's calories and they're now in a calorie surplus, that isn't sufficient to cause muscle gain in and of itself. So if someone doesn't put a stimulus on that muscle to grow, then it's likely they're just going to gain body fat, right? So if someone just lies down all day and eats a few extra 100 calories more than they need, it's likely they're not really going to build muscle tissue doing that, right? So that's why probably the main driver of gaining muscle is the resistance training stress that someone puts on it. It's not calories per se. So that makes it that it's not sufficient on its own to cause muscle gain. And a calorie surplus is also not necessary per se to gain muscle tissue, right? So we know certain individuals can gain muscle even in a calorie deficit, particularly if they're new to resistance training. Typically, if they haven't lifted weights before, that they'll gain muscle even if they're dieting. People who have had muscle and lost it previously, so they're coming back from an injury or a long time of not lifting weights, they can probably gain muscle without going into a surplus. And then even a lot of people at that beginner and intermediate stage can go through, I suppose, generally what people refer to as recomping, where just over a extended period of time, they will see slight increases in muscle gain from just having a good quality training program and sufficient protein intake, eating in and around maintenance, and doing all the things that support that. So yeah, it's different in that way that it's neither necessary or sufficient. However, what we're getting to is the question of, well, if we want to build the most amount of muscle possible, what is the best environment for that? And the best environment for that is a calorie surplus. So I think that's interesting point to note, that it's not necessary per se, but it is the best environment for that. And there's a cap on how much muscle you can build in any period of time. And so, like I said, the main driver of gaining muscle is not calories. The main driver is the resistance training stimulus. Calories are just there to support that. So the calorie surplus supports it. So I think Eric Helms has a lovely phrase where he says that calories aren't the driver, they're permissive to doing so, right? So to gain muscle mass at the fastest rate, then an anabolic environment is permissive to do so, but the main thing driving that is the actual resistance training adaptations. So because it's driven by those resistance training adaptations, there's a certain limit that once you go beyond a certain degree of calorie surplus, you can't gain muscle tissue at a faster rate just by eating more and more calories. So all you will do is just gain more and more fat tissue with that, which is why it comes to that question of, okay, well, what is that sweet spot that we want to hit, where we're not gaining way too much body fat, but we also know that we're maxing out how much muscle we're building, that we're not cheating ourselves by going so slow that in that time we could have actually built a bit more muscle. And that's the real kind of question that people want to try and answer. And there's a couple of different schools of thought of the best way to do that, but I think that's the general direction that people want to go. So hopefully that answers the question in a long roundabout way.
Would you say that if you increase calories and that leads to even more performance, which would lead to at least theoretically a better or bigger stimuli, would you say that then increasing the caloric surplus would also lead to more muscle gaining?
Yeah, I mean, definitely more calories has that benefit if it's going to drive performance adaptations for sure, or performance, and then in turn that performance is going to drive progress, particularly when you stack it over a long period of time. So, for example, we know the correlation between, say, training volume and the ability to, let's say, appropriate amount of training volume at an appropriate stress is going to drive those changes. So if increasing caloric intake allows someone to do more of that good quality work, then theoretically they should be able to build more muscle mass per se. So I definitely think that's worth taking into account. But the other thing is that we're trying to balance it with the caveat of how much fat mass do we want to have permissible? Because if you want to gain just the absolute most amount of muscle and you don't care about how much body fat you gain, then you can go really aggressive with a surplus, and that will guarantee you're going to go at the fastest rate. And it's why you see, like if you just look at the body composition of like super heavyweights in a lot of strength sports, it's just insane the amount of lean body mass that you have. It's actually probably more than you might predict. And getting to those absolute high levels of lean body mass is probably only possible because they were just able to gain so much total weight. But again, we're trying to do in the context of people that will have a different amount of body fat, which they deem acceptable for their goals and their circumstances. But yeah, to answer your question, I think the performance benefits that come along with a calorie surplus, to me at least, would make a good plausible reason that we would get better results doing so than trying to do this recomping where you're just capping your calories at a maintenance level and not going into a surplus at all. Virtually nearly across the board, I would say most people over a long enough time period would see a performance benefit to a few more calories there.
Yeah, I think it's just important to say that all the things we're talking about right now, they are highly context dependent. And I think in practice I tend to aim at a specific rate of gain, even like a range for that specific individual that seems appropriate, and then I just go with performance, the body weight, and also how that increasing body weight changes the visuals and pictures. So if somebody is gaining at a let's say at least theoretically high rate, but the pictures are holding up and their performance is going through the roof, then I would, the last thing I would do is pull calories. At least if like a potential contest prep is more far away than, let's say, next year or something like that.
Yes.
And I think with those things, you really also want to have a look at the obviously body comp, performance, appetite, hunger, well-being with the individual, and also potentially at least at the higher peaks of body weight on cardiovascular health that may influences your hypertrophy training in a bad way at a certain point.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Like you say, if someone is really responding well to a certain surplus, they're feeling good, performance is going well, and let's say you see their body weight increases a slight bit higher than you would have predicted or planned, it doesn't make sense to suddenly jump and, I need to fix this, because like you say, everything else is going well. And realistically, the amount of extra body fat they may be gaining is relatively going to be quite small, in that you can get that down really quickly, right? So like if someone, let's say over a whole gaining phase, they gained an extra kilo of body fat, like to get that off we're talking about a short number of weeks. It's not a huge deal relative to stopping someone in their tracks when everything else is going well. So I think that's a really good point that you make.
I mean, even if it's more than 1 kg, if you're at least if you have some dieting experience, you can lose those few kgs in a matter of weeks.
Right.
So could you dive in a little bit more into the mechanisms that are causing really, really low appetite and lethargy, especially in peak body weights? Do you have experience on that as well?
In terms of when people are in a gaining phase?
Yeah. When they're in a gaining phase and they're, let's say, maxing out their peak body weights in like peak off season.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this comes down to and there's a few different theories on body weight regulation that people will see talked about, whether that relates to set point theory, which used to be kind of quite popular, or then there's a discussion of there's these settling ranges. Then there's been some other hypotheses. One comes from, say, John Speakman's lab, but different theories around how body weight regulates itself. And essentially what a lot of them have in common is that there's at least some degree of a range or a point that the body is attempting to stay within. So again, like a homeostatic mechanism, that it doesn't want to drop too far below or too far above. And especially if you're trying to push more and more body weight, and particularly when you're going to body weight ranges that you've never gone to before, again, you're going to have those internal drives by the body to come back down to its quote unquote normal range. And again, I'm talking very simplistically about some of these theories, but that's the kind of general thread that runs through a lot of them. So in the same way that your body has responses to when you undereat, it has the same when you overeat, but particularly the longer that goes on with increased body weight. And so if we think about this again, probably from an evolutionary lens, which where some of these theories will first arise, is that it's going to be able to, let's say, cap or stop you from continuing to gain more and more body mass by essentially affecting the processes that are causing you to get there, in terms of, okay, how do we decrease the amount of food this person is consuming? And maybe how do we increase their energy expenditure? And that's where you get some of those hormonal changes. So when you're just constantly having to eat quite a lot of food all the time, obviously things like your ghrelin levels or appetite levels never really build up because you're not going for long stretches without a lot of food. You'll have changes in, let's say, the hormone leptin, which influences both intake and expenditure. So leptin is a hormone that is secreted by your fat cells. And when you have a lot of circulating leptin, that essentially tells your body, hey, we've got a lot of stored energy, we're pretty good. And so in that case, it can have an influence of, okay, we don't need to seek out as much food, and also maybe have a higher drive to go and increase energy expenditure. So that's why, without noticing, when someone is in a gaining phase, you have this real ramp up in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And then the same thing, we get some of these changes in some of those hormones that affect appetite and hunger. And so yeah, people typically are just going to not feel hungry, but yet still need to eat a lot more calories, which is why people then have to resort to things like, well, how can I make more meals more palatable? Maybe I need to increase my meal frequency to get foods in. Maybe I need to even decrease or increase the calorie density of some of these meal options. So take out things that are very low calorie density foods, and so on, as ways to stay hitting those calorie intakes, even though they don't want to eat. And so, yeah, they're essentially all adaptations by the body to not continually see this rise in body weight. And there seems to be at least some type of range that it's trying to protect, particularly when people have been doing this for a long period of time. So it's not really going to happen, I'd say, in someone just new to lifting weights. They'll typically be able to stay gaining quite linearly for at least a while. But people that have been doing this for a considerable period, then yeah, it becomes quite difficult for some of those reasons.
Could you explain the mechanisms of lethargy in peak body weights, especially if you're in a postprandial time frame?
So I think one of the aspects related to this is just when you have to eat very large meals in order to hit your caloric intake, there is a degree of lethargy that comes in that period after consuming the meal. So like you said, this is called the postprandial period. The name for this that people might see in the literature is postprandial somnolence, which is essentially when there is a large meal consumed. In that digestive period afterwards, there is this kind of feeling of tiredness that typically results from that. And again, why this would have first emerged, or how humans would have adapted to that. Again, we could think of what might make sense. For example, when you've consumed a big meal and you want to focus on digestion, your body probably wants to be in a resting state. It doesn't want to have a huge amount of food that it has to now digest whilst you're going and doing exercise, for example, or being super active. At that time, when you are in a mode where you want to digest food, you want to be resting. Hence, this kind of phrase, rest and digest, that people may have heard. So one way for the body to almost force that is, well, when we have a large amount of food that we have to get through and digest, maybe we can make we can be in a resting state by increasing this kind of feeling of lethargy. So I think it's quite common for people to notice after large meals that they get this. That's usually the explanation for why they feel tired, versus other claims that people might make about, it's carbs are bad for you because they're making you tired, and usually it's probably just you've just had a large meal and that was it. So that's a well-known thing in that kind of postprandial period.
Yeah, I think especially in physique realms, even probably if you look specifically at bodybuilding and physique sports, I think just force feeding in a peak off season is a normal thing, or at least a normalized thing, let's say. And I think for peak body weights, it's just really important to know when to drop back. So you just don't push it for the sake of pushing it, and you, let's say, all the markers that we established are directing in a direction where you should probably lose some body weight before you continue to gain. But rather, I think it's also, especially with the low evidence for P ratios and a lot of anecdotes for higher body weights in bodybuilding, I think it's reasonable to at least try it in your relative context or setting. I mean, obviously somebody who's naturally really, really, really lean will probably not peak as high as somebody who has like a, let's say, higher body fat settling point or settling range, who is then pushing it. And obviously with physique sports, it's also that you should keep your contest schedule in mind. So if you plan to do a 3 years off season, it's maybe worth to do that push in the first year rather than the second or third year.
Right.
Because at some point you have to lose it again, at least partly.
I think you're right. I think it is prudent to have that whilst you're still feeling like you can do it and it's not becoming a huge deal to get more food in, to continue riding that wave and kind of pushing where you can get to in terms of that peak body weight. But like you said, being very mindful of, okay, what does my timeline look like for my next contest prep? And therefore, how far above this do I want to go? And I think I've seen, for example, Alberto Nunez, I think has been one person that I know is very clear on, okay, based on their timeline of how long this off season is going to be, that will dictate how much of an increase above their stage weight that I'm going to allow that person to go. So the longer that they're going to have, obviously they can allow them to drift to a higher point. But again, it's just the idea of knowing that you want to be starting your prep in a position that's not going to make it a complete mess. All right. So just keep that in mind. But be able to push those boundaries when you need to, I guess.
And I mean, if you have more to lose, then you should at least plan in more time and maybe even frame out the diet even more, that you have a diet before the diet, then a period of maintenance or slow rate of gain before you then actually do your prep.
Yes.
I think Alberto is actually a guy who's naturally relatively lean, who still at this point in his career pushes it, but who also has done like incredible push-ups. I think he was 230 pounds or something like that in the past, in his 20s. And I mean, they're probably a little bit too much for his frame and training age and even body height.
Yeah, because he's interesting when you hear him talk about some of that stuff of how going to that extreme, but then in the years since kind of finding where that sweet spot is. I think he's a lot of wisdom in that. that he passes on. So yeah, that's a really interesting case for people to look through and hear his analysis of it himself.
And I mean, the guy is still not holding himself back in at least in the recent off season that he's doing right now. I think maybe in the one before, or even the one before that, I think retrospectively he's talking about how he maybe stayed a little bit too lean there. So yeah, I mean, I actually have the last question, which was, could you explain what happens on average on the CICO equation when you peak off season? I think we kind of explained that anyway, right? Or do you want to add something to that question?
No, I think we did a good job, and but if there are any follow-up questions that people have that wasn't clear, I'm happy to take them. But I think most of those ideas of how this might relate at that off-season phase hopefully should make sense on what we've covered so far. I think we covered that pretty well.
So coming up, actually, it is at least in my realm, it recently got more into common practice that maintaining a peak weight in like an off season, or even like pre contest prep or pre long diet, before for example a bodybuilding contest prep, do you think there's merit in that? And if so, what do you think is merit in there?
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely understand the rationale for that for sure, and mechanistically why that would make sense for that the body is able to adjust to things. So I think it certainly would make more sense that when you reach that peak body weight, let's say, particularly if it's somewhere that person hasn't been before, being able to hold at that for a while makes sense. And I think probably anecdotally people will know, okay, after I hold at that for a while, consuming that amount of food again is less of a challenge than it was before, and that feels like there's some degree of adjustment. And I'm sure physiologically someone could make a good case that if you went from reaching that peak to immediately dieting, let's say, that you might be at more loss of losing tissue. I'm sure someone could make that claim. I'm not too sure if we actually know for sure what the differences would be. But yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. Both physiologically, it has some merit, I guess, but even behaviorally, I think there's a lot of utility in using those phases where body weight is being held constant as people transition, which I guess is kind of quite a popular strategy now as people are moving through different phases, to kind of use some degree of a maintenance block to hold weight stable for at least a certain period of time. So yeah, it would make sense to me that someone would do it, but I don't know if we can definitively say one way is 100% better than another way, or there's a clear significant difference. At least I'm unaware of. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I think the rationales mainly if you go hypercaloric after that hypercaloric phase, that you making that weight and current muscle mass more homeostatic through holding it, rather than immediately going from gaining to cutting. And I think in a gaining phase, kind of to break up your gaining blocks, you mainly do it to reestablish hunger, for example, at least on the nutrition side. I mean, we're not diving into the training side in this podcast, but on the nutritional side, it's probably mainly due to appetite and hunger reasons. And I think, I mean, you could maybe you can dive in there a little bit more mechanistically, but I think recomping, at least as a more advanced athlete, is probably even easier at a higher body weight than on a lower body weight. At least that will make sense to me.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think that idea of holding that weight stable, so there isn't a larger drop in muscle mass, like it seems like I can see that being plausible biologically, but I think it's also worth noting there's probably a lot of practical upsides too, of if we think going from the amount of food intake someone has when they've reached that peak body weight to what they might be dieting on, is probably a significant jump. versus if they did that stepwise, going from that kind of gaining phase down to a maintenance phase before dipping into a dieting phase. Yeah, it's just a less of a drastic change to what the diet looks like and the total amount they're consuming. So there's practical utility in addition to that kind of biological plausibility.
So do you think it's more likely for an advanced athlete to productively recomp at a higher body weight than at a lower body weight, or in general a higher body fat as well?
I've seen that point made and can understand that rationale. I don't know is the honest answer what we see, but yeah, I actually don't know.
Yeah, and that's totally fine. I was just asking, maybe you have some thoughts about it, rather than, I mean, for all those things we're probably, at least for a lot of things we're discussing here, we don't really have a definitive answer yet.
Right.
And I think there's a merit in discussing those things and just having thoughts from like people that have a higher expertise in those topics, like for example you in nutrition.
Yeah, I do think there is value in that. I would say though that the reason why I would be hesitant to answer, and I think there's actually better people, is that when we don't have kind of a good answer from research per se, what we're going to look at that's really useful data is people who have worked with a lot of physique athletes specifically, who are in this context. And given the fact that I don't coach bodybuilders through contest prep and so on, I wouldn't have the degree of anecdotal data that some of your other guests could actually say. Actually, through all these hundreds of people that we've looked at, that kind of would make most sense to us based on what we're observing. That would be far more valuable than me trying to make a stab at things, because like you say, we don't kind of know some of these answers.
And that's totally, that's first and foremost an honest answer and a good answer as well. I mean, super important to say if you don't know something.
Yeah, and there's lots of things I don't know, so I'm good at saying it.
I mean you can correct me, but you're more of a generalist in the nutrition side anyway, or what fields are you actually? Is there any field in nutrition right now that you are at this point specializing in? I mean, I know you are quite into the circadian rhythm side.
Yeah, so yeah, my interest jumped around quite a bit. Like I said, some of the work that I've produced most on in a sporting sense has been related to making weight in combat sports. And so a lot of my coaching experience was in that area, and I've written and produced a lot of work on that. So combat sport athletes doing weight cuts to make weight for competition, but also actually trying to win fights and doing so in a safe manner. So I've done quite a bit on that. And then on more of the nutrition for health side, I would say probably over the last couple of years, some of the big topics that we've tended to put out information on relate to, like I say, circadian rhythms or this area of chrononutrition. We've looked quite a bit at diet's relationship with heart disease, and then looking at more general health related questions that people typically have. For example, how much of red meat is correlated with good or bad health? What's the impact of dairy, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, a variety, but I'd say those few things, the chrononutrition and weight cutting, seems to be two areas that people have most cited some of the stuff I've produced, I guess.
Very cool. So coming back to the question, I think I can actually, at least from my side, anecdotally state that's probably more likely to have a good recomp effect if you're a little bit more into the I wouldn't even say like peak body weight, but at least you're not coming right off a diet, and you're probably a little bit more you're past, let's say, month where more where like a hypercaloric phase rather than in a hypocaloric phase. So I mean, it makes sense for me to not come out of a diet and then recomp for months, but rather do, or at least, I mean, even if it's only 1 month, because if you're coming out of a diet and you don't have a contest coming up, you want to maximize muscle gain, and you, as we established, you
Right.
more likely do that in a caloric surplus, at least if you're somewhat advanced.
Yes, yeah, I would agree. I don't see the value in not going into a caloric surplus for someone in that situation. At least over in a certain period of time, like you say, we could use a maintenance phase after that diet. But yeah, I think the goal should be to get that person in a caloric surplus for sure.
So, coming up to a topic that is I mean, just real quick, how are you on time? We didn't really discuss that before, so I just want
I've got about maybe 10 minutes, bring us up to the hour.
Okay, so do you think we can actually dive into that saving up calories question? Or do you think that will take up too much time?
I mean, it's up to you really. I mean, I could probably get through. Yeah, we could do one more question. Again, depends on how in depth you want to go. If it's something that you want a longer discussion on, we could definitely do this another time again for part two. But if you think it's going to be a relatively short one, we can do that now.
Maybe we can just to cap this off, then go into the last question, which was basically, could you broadly explain what happens on average to the CICO equation when you're deep in prep? I think that's more related to the topic than the other question. I mean, it's definitely a super interesting question, and I think really valuable, but I think it's just not, we will probably not get that through in 10 minutes. At least not with the detail you can explain it.
Yeah. I think there'd be more to say about that. So I think the question of what happens with energy balance when someone is deep in a contest prep should probably hopefully make sense to people now that we've discussed kind of what happens in a surplus or even in any what we actually touched on a bit with the dieting situation. But essentially, during a contest prep, this is a prolonged period of a caloric deficit, so a hypocaloric diet where there is continued weight loss. But you're also seeing this in people who are already incredibly lean and getting leaner. And so because there's a need to preserve as much lean body mass as possible, there also needs to be a rate of weight gain or weight loss that is not too fast either. Now, what happens is when you decrease your calories and go into a calorie deficit, like we mentioned earlier, there's going to be some degree of metabolic adaptation. So if you drop your calories by 500, your actual surplus is probably not going to be 500 calorie, or your actual deficit, I should say, is not a 500 calorie deficit because your energy expenditure has likely dropped. Now, what dictates how much that drops? We mentioned there's a genetic component that different people will see a different drop, but then for everyone, the bigger the calorie deficit is and the longer the diet is prolonged, you're going to see more of a metabolic adaptation. So in other words, your energy expenditure will drop more and more. So this is why over time, we can't just change our calories down once and never change them again. Because number one, obviously body weight is coming down. So there's less of a person. So they are going to have a smaller energy expenditure anyway. But then there's also a greater metabolic adaptation where they're actually going to be using up less energy from non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, and even physical activity, let's say, and they're eating less food, so that thermic effect of feeding is slightly down. But the main drop is going to be in non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, and that's going to drop more the greater the deficit and the longer it's prolonged. So the deeper someone goes into a contest prep, there's going to be a greater decrease in that energy expenditure, and so a certain degree of the calories that have been reduced at lower level will the deficit will shrink and shrink to the point where it becomes like not very significant, that there's no real change being observed. Hence why the coach will get the calories target downwards over time more and more in order to keep the rate of change going at the same time. So that's what you're seeing, that you're seeing that those metabolic adaptations and that decrease primarily in NEAT levels due to being in a prolonged caloric deficit. Hence why calories are going to get really low in the tail end of prep.
Yeah, I definitely have seen some pretty wacky stuff. Also, when looking at pushing someone's body weight, you sometimes just see increases in total energy expenditure or decreases in total energy expenditure that are really, at least on paper, don't really make sense. At least if you have the context of, let's say, the last few months of diet or even gaining phase. And I think it's just more of a matter how you adjust and versus where you start in both directions.
Yeah.
But for example, what I usually do if I drop someone's calorie, let's say somebody is on in a 500 calorie, just numbers are just theoretically, somebody is on a 500 calorie surplus and I want him or her into a 500 calorie deficit, so it's a 1000 calorie drop. I usually, if I want to induce that 500 calorie caloric deficit, I usually go in and reduce it even further by 100 calories to compensate the less thermic effect of feeding, because you dropped a total of 1000 calories. So things like that are probably useful. And I mean, deep in prep is a situation that is so individual from person to person, and some people just have to go really, really low. And I mean, some female athletes even are likely to lose their cycle as well, and it's such a filigrane state, and you definitely have to be careful about it.
For sure. I mean, you can't do a contest prep and not go into what's known as low energy availability, where you're not consuming enough to meet your body's needs. And so obviously in female athletes this will show up in the loss of the menstrual cycle, for example, but you're going to see many body systems negatively affected in both male and female athletes. So yeah, that's unavoidable due to the extremes that need to be got to get that lean, and the low calories. And then, like you say, the difference between individuals is very large, because we know those metabolic adaptations, particularly in changes in NEAT levels, vary by a huge amount from person to person. And so that's why two people who started at the same weight, maybe even maintain weight on the same number of calories, end up having to diet on drastically different. So you can look at one person and like,
that's a good point.
Oh, this is the super lucky guy who's like still eating what for a contest prep seems like a huge amount of food and losing, and someone else eating basically nothing to try and get the same rate of change. And again, they could be people that started at the same weight and usually maintain on the same number of calories, but what they need to get to in order to lose that body weight can be different. And the reason for that is the genetic difference in those metabolic adaptations.
Yeah, and that's also one of the reasons why it really doesn't make any sense to compare macros in individuals. Yeah,
you can't predict ahead of time. And that's why those changes are needed throughout that prep, right? You can't start a prep and then say, okay, here's each month, this is what your macros are going to look like for the next 8 months. Like, this is not going to work. It's obviously absurd, because you don't know until that person is doing it how their body is actually responding. So yeah.
And also coming back to the loss of the menstrual cycle, I have heard from people that had not gained it back for years, and vice versa. I have people that have gained it back in a couple of days, and even I have heard from a friend of mine who has done her second prep that the first prep she got it back. It definitely took a long while to get it back, and in the second one, I think it was a matter of weeks. So yeah, I think your body is even the same body, even the same individual physiology is responding differently from prep to prep. So it's no prep is really the same.
Yeah, there's so many of those individual elements that are really interesting, and like even at what body fat percentage a female is going to lose their menstrual cycle once they go beyond can be wildly different. And so, there's so many of these factors that make it difficult to predict ahead of time and almost impossible to compare between two individuals, really.
Really cool. So Danny, we're coming close to time. So would you just I would like you to plug your Sigma Nutrition company and all your social media, although there's probably not too much from the social on the social media side, at least.
Yeah, I'm not so good at Instagram, but I mean, people kind of follow me there for sure. I still put some posts up.
Get the clothes.
I'm just not the good at it. So if they like listening to podcasts, then Sigma Nutrition Radio is my podcast. You can just find it on any podcast app you're currently listening on. Check that out. We have a lot of written content that's available for free over on the website. Particularly, we have what we're calling our Sigma statements, which are long form pieces of writing on typically controversial or confusing topics related to nutrition that we basically lay out. Here's our position on it. Here's all the evidence as to what we should understand on it. We've covered things like diet and heart disease, diet inflammation, diet and immune function, impact of dairy, impact of red meat, calories in, calories out, and all these different types of topics that people might find useful. Just go to sigmanutrition.com and have a look through any of that stuff. That's probably the best way to find some of my work.
And I will make sure to link that in the description. So thanks, Danny, and I wish everybody a good day.